Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a program looking at the extraordinary legacy of the nation's first family. This program is presented in partnership with our neighbors up the street, the American Ancestors American Inspiration Author Series. And we trust you will be inspired tonight. I am Catherine Allgore, the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. At the MHS, we believe that history is not merely a collection of dates and events, but a powerful tool that can shape our understanding of the world. This evening, our author, Cassandra Good, will delve into a revealing true story of power, fame, and drama, and offer really a remarkable view into the Custis and Washington families and Virginia history. And if you haven't already, I encourage you all to read this insightful book. And on the screen and in the chat, you're going to see a link to purchase First Family. So I always start off by saying it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers, but I have to say it's an especial pleasure tonight. I've long been a fan of Dr. Cassandra Good's work and was honored to be asked to blurb her current work, and I positioned it as an important contribution to the revisioning of what we call family history. And tonight, Cassandra Good is in conversation with our own Dr. Sara Georgini. I'm a pretty big fan of hers as well. They will discuss First Family, George Washington's heirs, and the making of America. Cassandra Good is a writer and historian focused on gender and politics in early America. She is the author of the prize-winning Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic. She is taught at Marymount University, George Washington University, and the University of Mary Washington, and has written for venues as diverse as Smithsonian Magazine, The Atlantic, Slate, and my favorite, Mental Floss. Sara Georgini is series editor for the papers of John Adams, part of the Adams Papers editorial project based here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where she has worked on nearly 20 volumes of the edition. She is the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family, and the forthcoming Our Library in Paris, as well as the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Family History and Genealogy. It is my honor to turn things over to Cassandra and Sara.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everyone. We're delighted to be here tonight to welcome Cassie Good to hear about First Family, which is, as Catherine said, a really wide-ranging and intellectually enriching view of family history in that critical period between the Revolution and the early Republic through people we think we know, the Washingtons, but as your book proves, Cassie, they need another look. So I hope we'll start where many of us begin our family history quests, with a picture, kind of a mystery image that tells us some things and sparks some new research leads. Can you tell us a little bit about this very iconic portrait of the Washington family on your cover by Edward Savage? What does it tell us and what doesn't it tell us?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me tonight, to the Society and to Sara, who we've known each other a long time and really respect her work. And she answered questions from Adam's materials throughout working on this project. But yeah, so to dive into this painting, and this is actually a really large painting if you go see it at the National Gallery. I just stopped by it the other day. I was reminded just how much presence it has on the wall. Most Americans would have experienced this as a print in their homes. And what you're seeing is George and Martha with their two of their four step-grandchildren. The boy on the left is George Washington Parke Custis, and the girl helping hold the map of DC open is Eleanor Parke Custis, later Lewis. And I'm going to call throughout, because these names are really long, call him Wash and call her Nelly. You also see standing in the background here, and clearly not as much detail in the painting, an enslaved house servant. And it's not clear that he is supposed to be a specific individual, but it does remind us that enslaved people are always present in this family. They're in Virginia both on the Washington and Custis sides. They own many, many enslaved people. And then there's two other people left out, which is the two older siblings of Nelly and Wash, Elizabeth Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis, later Peter. So I'll call them Eliza, and then Martha is Patty. And those sisters, while not living in the Washington's household, were frequently with the Washington family and known as part of this first family.
Fascinating. And so what did you actually have kind of as genealogical material going into this project? And then I love this opener in your book. How did a mystery package in the mail really set off your research in a new direction?
So what this started with was thinking I wanted to know what happened to the next generations of George Washington's family. And I sort of was talking about it as George Washington's descendants, but of course he didn't have any direct descendants. He never had biological children. We think he couldn't. And I was just curious, what happens to his family after he's gone? He has been treated almost like a king as the first president. He is so famous and so revered. And so I was trying to figure out who the descendants were. And I started with the package in the mail was a rolled up family tree, which was 5 or 6 feet long when you unrolled it. And it was just the Washington side. So in fact, the Custis kids are not even on this family tree because they are not blood related to George Washington. Martha came into their marriage with 2 children from her first marriage. And then one of them, Jackie or John Parke Custis, had 4 children, then died very young. So I realized from looking at this family tree, this was going to be a much more complicated story. And it was going to take multiple family trees to piece together who these people were, who really was following in Washington's footsteps, protecting his legacy. And that was also going to take not just looking at a family tree, but looking at the records they left to figure out who is playing this role, who does the public think of as Washington's heirs. So yeah, it ended up being a much more complicated question. And I think that long family tree was the first hint at how messy it was going to be.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting sequel in some ways to your first book on founding friendships, right? Getting into the private relationships and emotional character of some really famous figures. On that note, can you tell us what were George and Martha Washington like as parents, as grandparents, as step-parents? Because they have what might be a very interesting family setup that they create. How common was this? What were they like as grandparents?
Well, and I think this is one of the fun parts of doing the kind of history that in some ways both of us do is sort of uncovering private lives of people that we think that we know. And when you read all of somebody's letters and not just say their correspondence to other politicians, when you look at George Washington, what he's saying first to his son Jackie or stepson Jackie, and then later to Wash, those letters are sort of, like 20 years apart, deja vu, because both of the boys were very bad students. And George Washington got extremely frustrated with both of them, tried to get them to stay in college, tried moving them to different colleges. And so those letters are a little bit better known. But then there's some letters between George Washington and Nelly and Eliza, just a couple that survive. But those are really amazing because he's writing 2 of the letters that we have are letters to each of them, giving them courtship advice. But it is clear to him that they are very different young women and they need different kinds of advice. And you can see him really playing the father figure here and talking to them about what they should look for in a life partner, what marriage is about. Because Nelly had pretty much insisted to him that she was going to be a spinster for life, that she was going to remain single, but spinster is the word she used. And he said, you never know when you're going to meet somebody and fall in love. That's pretty much what his response was to her. And so you see this much softer, more human side of him there. And so in that sense, he's stepping in as a father figure. He is pretty much raising, along with Martha, and of course, the aid of many enslaved people who were serving the children's daily needs. He is basically an adoptive parent for Wash and Nelly. There's no legal form of adoption at this point. So it was fairly common at this time, because of how many people died prematurely, for children, and especially if you have a family with a large number of children and one of the parents dies, or even both, the children are going to be raised by relatives. There's never an official adoption. But Wash was certainly known for the rest of his life as George Washington's adopted son. They weren't using the term stepson at that point, or step grandson. These are modern terms. But, when we talk now about different configurations of family, the fact is that in the 18th century, there were lots of different configurations of family. There were all sorts of different people raising children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, family friends. That was normal.
What does this do to the Washingtons' finances as they enlarge their family?
Actually, they don't have to spend their own money on it. And in fact, they are getting an allowance for each kid from the Custis estate. So in fact, they do sometimes spend their own money. You can see in George Washington's account books when he has spent his own money on something from them. But you can also see in the accounts for the Custis estate that he's getting money paid to him to take care of the children. And a lot of their needs are coming out of that money.
It's really interesting to think about this founding generation and the pressures on the ones that follow. I think immediately of what happens in the Addams family, right, with John and Abigail and their kids. Yet the Washington heirs, female and male, have very different sets of opportunities, right? Often because of their gender and their kind of celebrity status. How do Jackie, Wash, and Bushrod have a different experience than Nellie, Patsy, and Eliza? How are they set up differently to succeed or not?
Well, and I'll just explain who Bushrod is with that very funny name. So this is Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew, who is the one that he leaves the Mount Vernon estate to. And he is also, people sometimes say, oh, Washington left the estate to Bushrod because Bushrod was his favorite nephew. I think it's more complicated than that. Bushrod was the most successful out of his nephews, and he also was the eldest son of Washington's eldest full brother. So by sort of tradition, he would be the one to get it anyway. There's also a relationship between Bushrod's father and Washington that plays into this. But Bushrod was very well educated, had a legal apprenticeship, and George Washington actually wanted him to run for Congress. And when he decided to take Adams' offer of a seat on the Supreme Court, he basically apologized to George Washington because it was not a prestigious position. And he knew that Washington had actually wanted him to run for office. Jackie did technically serve in the Virginia state legislature, but he didn't really show up. And then he died fairly young. So there's not really that sense of what his career would have been like. I suspect it would have been fairly like Wash. Wash, when he was very young, ran for state legislature once. And then once the District of Columbia was created, George Washington Parke Custis was living technically within the borders of the district. He was in what's now Arlington, Virginia. That was part of the district. He couldn't run for office. I don't think he would have if he could have at that point. I do think the expectations for him were very high. He gave a lot of speeches. He wanted to serve the public in certain ways, but I think people couldn't help sort of comparing him. And he clearly did not have the sort of personality, the demeanor, the seriousness that George Washington did. He was never going to be like his step-grandfather. And there were people that made fun of him, that called him ridiculous, that joked about him. On the other hand, some of his speeches were very popular and copies of them sold. So, for some people, he was a laughingstock. For other people, he was a great orator. And then the girls actually were more engaged, especially Eliza and Nellie, in political conversation than I think Wash usually was. I mean, Wash was at every inauguration, but Eliza especially was really into the details of legislation and what was happening with wars and wanting to pass on her suggestions to cabinet secretaries. Her aunt said at one point that the problem with her is that she really should have been able to wear pants. In other words, she would have been happier as a man. And I think that's because she really felt stifled by how little power she had. And, she sort of inflates her own influence later in her life, but she was good friends with Dolly and James Madison. She was good friends with Aaron Burr when he was vice president. She did have a lot of political connections. Nellie also was fairly well connected, especially as she got older. And she was good friends with Zachary Taylor and went to visit the Taylors at the White House, and even brought a whole basket of stuff she had sewn for them, and some Washington relics. So in a sense, it's the girls who are more politically engaged. And Bushrod, I should also say, as Supreme Court Justice, is not going to make public pronouncements usually about policy, although the justices were much more political than we often think, which you can stay tuned for Rachel Sheldon's new book coming out in a year or two on this. But for the most part, the most political people in this family are Nellie and Eliza.
That's completely fascinating, and I want to talk more about Nellie in a moment. This is wonderful for us to chat because we get to kind of have the same chat about our research we all had during the pandemic, you and me on Zoom, but now we have hundreds of people reading your book too, which is fantastic. But something that we talked a lot about, and I really wanted to learn from you on, was how you also researched and told the story of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon, because they are certainly key figures in this book, if they are not always present in the historical record. You also, I think, worked very hard thinking about the language to use around them in terms of enslaved or bondspeople or other terminology. Can you talk a little bit here for how you researched their lives and kind of brought their voices into the story?
Yeah, that was certainly the hardest part of this book because of the challenges of records here. But it was also the most important part to me to get right. And I was lucky to have the chance to meet descendants of some of the enslaved people and actually had them read portions of this and say, is this okay with you? I also talked to, in terms of language choices, even on the family tree, when I had, Jackie Custis having a child with an enslaved woman. So there is likely, which we can talk about later, a Black half sibling of the four Custises. How do I show that on a family tree? Because he's shown with a spouse. And I spent a lot of time talking through that because I've got a family tree at the beginning of the book. And then, do I say child by an enslaved woman from? And I talked to a genealogist who focuses on African-American families about what language was being used on family trees in communities she works in. I was lucky that at Mount Vernon, they had done a lot of work on this. And George Washington kept incredibly detailed records. So we can get a lot from those records. And he's even keeping records on people that are, so a lot of people don't realize that more than, about half of the people at Mount Vernon were owned by the Custis estate. So they were sort of Martha's. She had use of them during her lifetime, but then they were automatically going to get divided up among the grandchildren after her death. And so that's about 160 people. And then once they get divided up, there's the paper trail sort of scatters and in some places dries up. With most of the Custises, they were not record keepers in the way that George Washington was. If they were, the records don't survive, but I suspect that they weren't keeping records that careful. So it was really tough. It was looking at letters for mentions of people. There was a descendant actually a descendant of Nellie Custis Lewis, who had researched his branch of the family and been interested in slavery. And he sent me a legal some legal documents from the courthouse in Louisiana where they had moved to help me fill in some of this. And actually that research is still happening. I'm going to meetings next week with descendants and Custis historic sites because we're still learning things, still figuring things out. But part of it, was genealogical research. Part of it was looking at the manuscripts. Part of it was talking to descendants. And then also running my research by other people who had done research in these areas to make sure I was reading the evidence properly. Because some of these things, you think you understand what it is, and then somebody else who's seen the documents like this before says, no, that's not what's going on here. It's actually this other thing. And so just sort of questioning everything that I looked at. And that's, this book took about a dozen years to write. And part of that was because of making sure I got the research on slavery right.
Land is very much a character in the book, right? The sense of Virginia geography and ownership, and as a space between the enslaved people and the Washington family. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of how you mapped out the major places where they circuited through in Virginia, and kind of the importance of distance or proximity to telling family history?
Yeah, and so we'll get the map up here that shows where all of their houses are in the DC area. So Tudor Place is the only one that is in what is now DC. Arlington House, as I mentioned, Arlington would have been part of DC until retrocession in 1846. So Tudor Place was Patty Custis Peters' house. And, saying it was hers and not her husband's, we're still looking into, the Tudor Place staff is still trying to confirm this, but the records have suggested that it was her money from the Washington estate that built that house. Arlington House, Wash Custis's home, which is above Arlington Cemetery. Hoxton House, that is not a historic site now. It is actually the main campus building for the Episcopal School, a private prep school in Alexandria. But that's where Eliza, that was sort of her only home of her own. And then Woodlawn, you can see down near Mount Vernon, because it was actually split off from the Mount Vernon estate and given to Nelly and her husband when they got married. So you can see that all the siblings live pretty close to one another. What you're not seeing here is that a lot of the Custis land and money is actually in the Tidewater of Virginia, east of Richmond. And they have a bunch of plantations in that area, as well as at the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. And there's also some little islands off the coast there where they had plantations. Those plantations also had hundreds of enslaved people. And so Wash is the one that inherits all of that. But the girls are also inheriting somewhere around 60 people each from those lands farther south who are getting moved and separated from their families to be distributed as dowry for the girls. So these properties, none of these are huge. Mount Vernon is, the biggest of them, but the really big Custis land is farther south.
So when George and Martha die, there are plans for an auction, yes, in 1802. And it involves relics, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And even, I think I got this right, George Washington's bedpan is up for sale or available.
So basically the way this worked is that when George Washington died, everything that he owned, all the, small movable property in the house, goes to Martha. When Martha died, by the terms of her will, there are a few objects that she designated to give to specific people, as George had done. But otherwise, she said, sell everything in the house and use the money to educate these two nephews of mine. So they set up this auction, and the siblings basically seem to go in and buy everything first. So by the time that the public comes, because it's been advertised in the newspaper, by the time the public shows up, there's not a lot left. But in terms of what's being sold, yeah, it's everything from nice imported French furniture to the daily household necessities, like a bedpan, like water cans for putting out fires, like farm tools. I mean, they are selling absolutely everything you could move. So Wash Custis buys the most of it. He spends way more than he can afford, $5,000, which at the time is a large amount of money. He doesn't have that money. He doesn't even have a house yet to put all of this stuff in. Martha Custis Peter seems to have gotten the bedpan as part of a sort of lot of sundry items, is what I think it probably fell under. If you look at, we actually have pretty good records of who bought what. And it makes sense. She was having babies at this point, and women had a period called lying in where they had to stay in bed for a while, and she would have been using a bedpan. But the Peters also treated every Washington object they had as a relic, even if they were still using it in daily life. So at a certain point, the descendants of Martha Custis Peter numbered every single thing that they had and labeled it. And when the bedpan actually came to Mount Vernon, it had been labeled as a warming pan. I think maybe they thought it was to like warm up plates for a meal. And when it was sent to be conserved, the conservators said, no, this is a bedpan. So there were items down to a bar of soap that supposedly had been the Washingtons from Mount Vernon that the Peters had. So they were treating these objects, they're everyday objects, but they're also relics. And maybe we can look at that image of one relic that the Massachusetts Historical Society has, which I don't think came to Martha Custis Peter in the sale. I think this must have been given to her earlier. So I think it's back to, there we go. So this is George Washington's gorget. Imagine this on basically a necklace hanging around his neck. And he would have worn this when he was in the British Army. If you look on there, this is partially a sort of royal insignia that mentions Virginia. He was serving in troops in Virginia as part of the British military. So this is before the Revolution. And there is an image of him with a gorget, not this one, famous portrait. But how did this end up in Boston? So Martha Custis Peter, like the Federalist Party, tended to be more pro-British. The Democratic Republicans were more pro-French. And she, like the New England Federalists, was very opposed to the War of 1812. During the war in 1813, she sent this to a friend in Boston as a sign to say, Washington's family agrees with what you all are saying. She sent it specifically to this friend who was leading the Washington Benevolent Society, which was a Federalist group. And so she sends this, it makes the newspaper, and, the Washington Benevolent Society people say, oh, we're glad to have the approval of Washington's family. Basically saying, yeah, Washington wouldn't have wanted this war. And then the Democratic Republican newspaper in DC gets a hold of this and says, well, we don't care what Washington's family thinks. That doesn't matter to us. I think some people did care, but this relic, this becomes a way for Martha Custis Peter to communicate her political position by giving this relic. And it's something that all of the siblings do with the relics. They're giving them at strategic points. They know it's going to make the newspaper, so that lets them sort of communicate politically. And the other thing I should say that Martha Custis Peter does to communicate her politics, she is pregnant with her last child when the British burn Washington, and she can see the burning from her house at Tudor Place on Hill in Georgetown. She goes into the city the next day. She meets the British soldiers who she thinks are just charming, learns that they are part of Wellington's troops from over in the Peninsular Campaign, has her baby 6 months later, and names her Britannia Wellington. That is just how pro-British she is. And I can't imagine that George Washington would have really appreciated that.
That's a really interesting story behind an MHS treasure. Thank you. Something that's interesting too about First Family is you have this really rich cast of characters, and a lot of them are women operating in a 19th century political realm, even though they are somewhat locked out of it. So forming political identities. And I think immediately of Nelly. And this is someone who, whenever we talked about this project, I wanted to know more about Nelly. The more I read about her, I wanted to hear more of her voice on domestic and foreign policy issues. Can you tell us a little bit about her, her life, and also kind of how she developed her sense of politics and how she implemented it in her own sphere?
Yeah, Nellie, I mean, we're lucky that there is a book of her letters that's been published. It's called George Washington's Beautiful Nellie. And then in addition to that, there are a lot of other letters from her as well. So part of it is we probably have more letters from her than from pretty much any other, maybe outside of the Adams, any other women from this period. It's just a huge volume of letters. She wrote a lot of them to one friend in Philadelphia that were saved. She spent a lot of time in Philadelphia when George Washington was president. She gets the best education you could get in America at the time. She has, a drawing master, a dancing master. She has all these different teachers. She plays the harpsichord. She is a good singer. She is a good artist. Some of that survives. And she's known as being really beautiful. That's where that George Washington's Beautiful Nellie title comes in. You have foreign visitors who meet her and are really impressed with her. And, one funny connection to the Adams here is that supposedly, John Adams said this much later to Louisa Catherine Adams, supposedly George Washington and John Adams were hoping that Nellie would marry John Quincy Adams. I don't know that they ever actually met before either of them got married. So I don't know how serious this was, but it would have been the uniting of two big Federalist families, which is interesting. She ends up marrying George Washington's nephew, Lawrence Lewis. And then Washington gives them this part of Mount Vernon, where they have built, I should say, this house, Woodlawn. We don't know too much about, we know there were some hired builders that were probably enslaved builders. Woodlawn is doing a lot of research still on this, but you can see it's, a beautiful house also on top of a hill. You could have seen Mount Vernon from it at the time, which was kind of painful for her. She missed being at Mount Vernon, and she really missed being in the action of politics because this is not that far from DC now. It's maybe a 40-minute drive. Back then, this was pretty isolated. So she had grown up being a celebrity in Philadelphia, meeting all these important political figures. She was good friends with Jefferson's daughter when they were in school together. And then she's basically isolated on this plantation and has 8 kids. She outlives 7 of her children. So, 3 of them do live to adulthood, but actually this painting of her by Gilbert Stuart from 1804 is not long after she has lost, I think, 2 children at this point and lost her grandmother. And I do think you see a real sadness in her here. And she pretty much says multiple times later in her life that she never got over losing Martha Washington. And, she obviously has a lot of loss throughout her life with all of these children that she loses. But as her children get older, she goes back into Washington society more. She is, talking to political figures. She becomes friends with Joel Poinsett, who is a diplomat. The Poinsettia is named after him, and she is talking about taking Spanish lessons from him. She also befriends Andrew Jackson, one of his sort of wards or adopted sons. Actually marries her eldest daughter. And so she has that connection to Jackson, and she is a very strong Jackson partisan. Kind of strange because she had been a Federalist before. And generally the Federalists were not Andrew Jackson supporters, but she also, maybe because of that old story about John Quincy Adams, she really did not like the Adams. There was no way she was going to support John Quincy Adams. I don't know what her thing against him was necessarily. She never really said. She had pretty strong political opinions, though. I mean, she called James Polk a reptile. So yeah, she had some pretty strong opinions. Then, of course, as I mentioned, is a huge fan of Zachary Taylor, pretty much says this is George Washington reborn and sees him as the savior of the country. Of course, he dies like a year into the presidency, so does not make much of an impact. But yeah, I mean, throughout her life, even at the end of her life in the 1850s, she's still talking about politics to the end.
Friends, we're going to get to your questions in just a couple of minutes, so please drop them in the Q&A. I do want to pick up on kind of Nelly's 19th century there. I'm going to call it that instead of the Jacksonian era, because I think it's an interesting intellectual vantage point to take this very engaged, very political woman who's very connected as well. How do Washington's heirs approach this kind of half century where we're tumbling toward disunion, right? How do they approach questions of liberty and slavery, things that they grew up with that are very much ingrained in the family?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting questions for me was to think about how do the ideals of George Washington and the founding generation of the Declaration and the Constitution, how do those play out in this generation that says, the Custises, that they are carrying forth George Washington's legacy? Was George Washington's legacy to be pro-British in the War of 1812? Probably not. But, you know, these are the people that knew him closely, intimately as children and can lay some claim to him. And yet they are not promoting, for the most part, the causes that he would have cared about. I mean, Wash promotes domestic agriculture, domestic production. That was something George Washington cared about, but he never, it's not like he's ever successful in running plantations. He's always in debt. He's not serious about agriculture in the way that George Washington was. So none of them are sort of trying to serve the public in the way that I think George Washington and other public servants in this period were. I think they don't have that kind of civic mindedness, perhaps because of how much privilege they grew up with, and how high the expectations were for them. And then when it comes to slavery, you can see that, especially to a certain extent, Wash, the founding generation, people like George Washington sort of thought slavery would die out. And Washington thought that free labor, people that sounds like you're not paying them, but people who are free, that you pay to do labor, that was just a better system. He saw it in Pennsylvania. He saw these people had a better incentive to work. His big thing about slavery was not necessarily a moral thing, but just that it was not the best system of labor, was his feeling. And, you know, so that generation really thought slavery was going to die out. Once you get to the cotton boom, which none of the Custises are directly participating in, although they do, Nelly has 2 kids to move to Louisiana, and I think they're mostly growing sugar. Once slavery becomes really profitable, though, in the 1820s, like insanely profitable for some people, a lot of people in the country move in a pro-slavery direction. And that's what the Custises do. Any reluctance, I mean, Wash Custis talked in the mid-1820s about a plan to free his enslaved people. 10 years later, he's saying at a meeting in the American Colonization Society, which is a group that advocated sending freed Black people to Africa. He's saying this is a white man's country. That's the phrase he uses, and that Black people should not live in this country, which there's a lot of racism within the American Colonization Society, and even the members there thought that was too racist to say and booed him. So, and then you see, like, the next generation on, all of the Custis's kids fight for the Confederacy. That is not something that I think any of the siblings would have expected, especially Wash, who lived to 1857, in the 1850s was speaking out strongly for union. He might not be talking about liberty. He's not addressing the cause of slavery, but he knows how important keeping the country together would have been for George Washington. And that's what he's talking about.
That's really interesting. I mean, something that comes across so much in this same period in the Adams presidential volumes that we're working on now is the word that pops up the most is union. Always
Mm.
the need to kind of keep you, it's not United States or America, it's union.
Huh.
And this seems to be kind of the common language of so many people in the founding era that does get inherited in the next stage. I'm curious too, we're on the cusp of this big milestone, right? The 250th anniversary in 2026 of the Declaration of Independence. And you've just spent a decade with this founder and his family, really exploring new themes. I think there's so much more work to be done. What new themes can historians and scholars kind of pick up and explore in that period, thinking about 2026 and its impact?
Yeah, that, it's an interesting question. And I would direct anybody who works for a historical organization to the AASLH's 250th material. And one of their themes that they call out is unfinished revolution. And I like that phrase because I think that's part of what I'm talking about here with, the founding generation sets out these ideals. The next generation is not living up to them, right? In fact, they toss into a civil war because they can't uphold these ideals in certain ways. And so I think that idea of what were these great ideals in the Declaration and the Constitution, what work do we still have to do to achieve them? I mean, to me, I know that there's discussion in this country over, can you be critical? And to me, looking at what work do we still have to do is a patriotic project in certain ways. It's figuring out, from these documents that in fact, the Declaration was sort of a key document for enslaved and then free Black people to look to as to what this country's ideals should be. And then to say, what do we still have to do to get there? I think the other thing I would think about is what does it mean to participate as a citizen, to be part of civic life in this country? I think the Custises had an opportunity or certain opportunities where they could have served the country more. George Washington certainly did a lot to serve the country. And then, we didn't really get to talk about William Costin, the probable Black half sibling of the Custises, who, when there was a new law restricting Black freedom in DC, refused to follow it and took it to court and said Black people should be treated equally. We are citizens too. That is not an argument that the judge was going to listen to in 1821, but he, in some ways, is taking the kind of idealistic stand that was more reflective of the founding generation than what the Custises are doing. So I think this question of what does it mean to participate in civic life beyond just voting, I think is quite important.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on. And something that occurred to me kind of as you were talking was how you were able to use family history as a methodology to tell this narrative of the first century of the country and kind of where it goes, who's allowed to be involved in the dialogue and or process of democracy as it happens. And kind of what did you learn about doing family history? Going back to where we started before we roll into questions in a minute, so keep dropping them in the Q&A. What did you learn from the moment that you unpacked that mystery chart to the moment you finished writing the book? What tips or tricks do you have for us family historians in the audience?
Well, so I would say most broadly, and I think I gestured at this at the beginning, that family is not a given. And it is not just biological, that it is something constructed by people and in many ways. And, in the case of this family, the Custis children constantly reminded people who their family was. They didn't have that last name. They didn't have those biological ties, but they made a choice about who they were going to identify as their family. And we need to, I think that there's a lot of focus on DNA right now. And I don't have a problem with looking at DNA, but I think that we also need to recognize how much family is about choice and relationships that we build, and that family can change over our lifetime, that who we consider our family or who is the most important part of our family for us can change. In terms of doing research, I actually did research on my own family in the process of working on this book. And part of why I talk about that thing about DNA is that I actually had a distant cousin who found out from DNA that his father was not his biological father. And that sort of shifted his whole idea about who his family was. And I started thinking, does that change? How much does that change? Who is his family? He had traveled around the world visiting cousins on his father's side that he had found. I think those people are still his family. But it opens up interesting questions now, because that's not an uncommon experience for people doing these DNA tests. And I think also, I mentioned before when researching slavery, just questioning everything you see and not assuming that it means what you think it means. I was thinking about the fact that when I needed to find Eliza Custis's, she basically had a prenup when she got married because George Washington insisted she do that. And I was trying to find this, and it is technically filed with land deeds in the District of Columbia. I didn't know that land deeds covered all property agreements. Other people that had done that research knew. And I talked to somebody who did a research guide to the land deeds in DC, and he was the one who said, oh, no, like a agreement like you're talking about would be in the land deeds, even though this isn't necessarily about land. So even when I hit points where I thought I knew what I was looking at, it was constantly questioning that. And I think that asking those kind of questions and then asking other people who've done research in the specific area you're looking at. I mean, historians are always asking each other questions. I emailed you lots of questions while I was writing this. I emailed lots of people lots of questions. If you look at my acknowledgements, there's a very long list of people that answered questions. And so I just always encourage people to reach out to other experts.
Well, MHS and American Ancestors want to know, what are you working on next?
So next, we talked about women in politics. I have always been really interested in the topic of women in politics, going back to when I was an undergraduate. And my next project is on women's political participation in early America from the Revolution. The stopping point's a little unclear right now. It will either be the Civil War or Reconstruction, but I'm currently on a fellowship at the Smithsonian doing research on this, having a lot of fun doing that. And I want to piece together, there's been a lot of books on sort of founding era women, and then there's Reform and Civil War era women. And I'd like to sort of knit together those stories into one narrative and also use material culture and art. I'm spending a lot of time looking at paintings, including paintings of, the Senate chamber with women sitting in the balconies watching the debates.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that, it's a big project.
Wonderful. And that segues beautifully into our first question from our fabulous audience tonight. Mary Mass, thanks for a fascinating discussion about your book and the Washington Custis family. You mentioned the granddaughters are very interested in politics. Is this common? Did they write about their political views to friends or publish in the newspapers?
So yeah, I think it's actually much more common than people would think. When you start looking at women's papers from this time, literate women, part of their role, so we talk about the role, especially in this early Republic period, like 1780 to about 1830, as being Republican mothers or Republican women, and that's smaller Republican. And the idea is that they need to be well educated and know what's going on politically so that they can be a sounding board for their husbands and educate their sons to be good citizens. So to some extent, they're supposed to know what's going on, even if they're not allowed to officially weigh in. Now, they are generally not writing to newspapers in this period. However, when you get into the 1830s, 40s, and then really it explodes in the 1870s, there are a lot of women writing for newspapers and writing very political articles, really partisan, I should say, because newspapers were all partisan at this point. So female journalists, in a sense, were partisans. They were contributing political speech and trying to shape people's opinion. And that, it starts, you can go back to somebody like Margaret Fuller, and then, forward, you start getting Washington correspondents by the 1870s who are women. And then that's in addition, of course, to women discussing this in their own homes, definitely in letters. And sometimes they'll say, oh, I'm not a politician, but This is sort of their
Hmm.
blanket disclaimer that, or I'm not going to talk about politics, but, and then they go on and do it. And they're also, I talk a lot in my first book about the fact that they're writing to male friends as well. It's not just female friends. And women who are friends with politicians often use those friendships to get information about politics or try and influence those figures.
I think also of all the 19th century reform literature and women's reform movements where
Yeah.
politics certainly seep into the rhetoric, right, of all of that
Yeah.
material.
Yeah. And, part of what I'm seeing and doing research for this book is that a lot of those women involved in reform are also lobbying their state legislatures for different laws, sometimes at the national level, but they are, some of them believe they should stay out of politics. They believe in what's called moral suasion, but some of them, believe that they should be doing lobbying and getting particular laws passed to change the causes they care about.
Ooh, I want to know the answer to this one. Who was the most bookish or intellectual of the Washington clan?
Probably Nelly. I think so. Wash was not a big reader. Eliza doesn't really talk about books. Patty, we have very few letters from, so we don't know. So it's possible that Patty was, but Nelly definitely was a great reader, really liked reading literature, and sometimes talked about the literature that she was reading. And she was the best educated out of all of them. So it would make sense that it would be her.
Did any of George or Martha's descendants ever go into government or politics? Are any in it today?
So I can't speak to, if you look at the Custises, none of the grandchildren go directly, as I mentioned, they can't really, like the women cannot serve in office, and Wash for most of his life cannot. He's a justice of the peace at a certain point. Probably the closest, earliest example is Nelly's son-in-law is a senator, and then I think he's very briefly Secretary of War. And then he serves in the Confederate government as well. This is Charles McGill Conrad. And then, I didn't trace deeper down the generations whether any of them, no, I don't believe that any of them are members of the House or Senate, but they could have certainly served in other government capacities. The only Washingtons that serve, so there is a nephew of a great nephew of George Washington's that was a member of the House of Representatives, very briefly, from Montgomery County, Maryland. And he had a house in Georgetown as well. And he served for 2 non-consecutive terms. So that's about the extent of it.
Robin asks, was the Black descendant of Washington acknowledged by the family, and have his descendants gotten together with the white Custis descendants?
Oh, the Black descendant of Jackie Custis, William Costin. So I have not been able to locate current day descendants of William Costin. Mount Vernon had heard from somebody who was a descendant in the family 40 years ago, and she is no longer alive. And I even tried tracking down through her obituary if there were any descendants. I would love to meet descendants of that family. But as of right now, we do not know them. I'm hoping at some point that we can. Most of the descendants involved with working at Custis sites in Mount Vernon at this point, there are some descendants of people that were enslaved at Mount Vernon that were owned by George Washington. And then there are descendants of Custis enslaved people from even before, from earlier, before the move to Northern Virginia. So there's sort of a large group of descendants. And I think, Tudor Place, actually, for anybody who lives in the DC area, has a new tour that is centered around enslaved people, and they worked on it they only know descendants from 2 families so far. And so those family members did work on the tour, but part of what they were saying is they're hoping that they can find more people. But there are researchers actively looking at this point.
We have kind of a related question here about whether or not the Washingtons considered the family relationships of enslaved people when choosing to buy, sell, or give them to other family members.
I would say it depends. In terms of George Washington himself, he expressed multiple times that he did not want to separate families, but he would do it occasionally. So, for instance, I think in 2 different occasions, there were people that he thought were too difficult to manage. And that's probably a form of resistance, people who were enslaved, and he sold those people to the Caribbean. So they were separated from their families forever. Also, there were people separated within, so there were 5 farms at Mount Vernon. It was a very large estate. And he did not necessarily keep families together in terms of work, where they were assigned to work and live. So families were separated even within Mount Vernon. And then with the Custis enslaved people, when those 160 people were split between the 4 grandchildren, they did not appear, there's some families that get to stay together, but there's one family where the father had been owned by George Washington, so he was freed. The mother and the younger 2 siblings go to Woodlawn, to Nellie Custis Lewis, and then their older brother goes to Wash Custis at Arlington House. So there are a large number of families separated just in that division that the Custises do. And I never saw them express any concern about that.
It's fascinating. It's hard history to research and to write, for sure.
It is. It was painful at times. Yeah.
Finally, family history has its own long history. Can you say a little bit about how your work fits into or even transforms the genre?
That's interesting. So family history, some of family history, if you look at what was going on in the 80s and 90s in particular, was about, when does the nuclear family date to? Did the nuclear family ever exist? So it's partially conversations about that sort of hit a dead end at a certain point. And I think family history has moved beyond that. I don't think there are as many people doing family history as a field, certainly in early America, as maybe there were in the past. But what I'm seeing happening in the field is people looking at particular families, as you have done, as a lens to explore particular areas of history. I also think, and I certainly saw this in the literature in anthropology, people studying family or kinship, that understanding how families are constructed and built on choice, as I was talking about before, that's really the intervention I was trying to make in family history here, is to not take family as a given, to think about the choices people make and who they identify as their family and what that might mean in terms of who we identify as our family now.
Cassie, thank you so much. You've certainly helped to, with First Family, reboot our idea of what constitutes a family in past and present, early Republic and now. And we thank you so much for joining us tonight. You can learn a little bit more in the chat with a link to buy Cassie's book. And I am going to turn things back over now to Dr. Catherine Allgore. And many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hello, everyone. Oh, you've interrupted my tea out of my Martha Washington mug. Here we go. It's from the 19th century with George Washington on the saucer. So that's a little material culture for your evening. Cassie and Sara, thank you so much for that wonderful program. And it is always so exciting for me to read the chat and the questions, and this audience is, you all were just terrific. We are committed to bringing people together with interesting and educational content. We also host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. And we welcome your support to make thought-provoking programs such as this evening's happen. Thanks again to American Ancestors, to Cassandra and Sara, and to all of you out there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online this evening. Good night.